Okay, so you are ready to process your image for your purposes of processing your images. We need to take this image and we need to do noise reduction. And as you guys saw in previous lectures, you can use the sliders to do this manually. And it also, as I noted, it gets an amount of noise reduction that is default applied. So if I go into the detail panel, you can see that this image had a 25 slider of color correction automatically applied. And as you guys remember when I showed you before, if I pulled this out, you can see all the blooms of color with the red, white, and red, green, and blue. So that's basically how this works for noise reduction. And then, of course, you can go in and tinker with the luminance yourself manually and just try to get it to where you think it's the least amount of noise. But you gotta be careful because it can get too soft looking and painterly. So it comes down to just being a nuanced type thing. So with the advent of new technologies that Adobe has started applying to a lot of their programs, they are now starting to use their version of AI, which is kind of a funny term to use, artificial intelligence, because realistically it's not fully exactly artificial intelligence. But anyways, that's a debate for philosophy and technology, classes. Anyway, so let's take a look at this. This new feature is called denoise. Now, I'm going to really quickly note, I can apply to the Hawaiian luau photo, but I cannot apply this to certain file types. For example, here's a Fuji file that I shot years ago with a Fuji X10 little rangefinder camera, and this file format of RAF is not compatible with this feature. Now, it might be in later upgrades, but at this time it is not. Even if I convert this to a DNG and bring it in, it still won't. So realistically, I only have the old school sliders to use with this one. But if I go back to the luau photo and I zoom in, let's take a look at what happens when I click the denoise button. So when this pops in, it scans the image and it loads the enhanced data to do this, and it automatically adds a denoise. You can see really quickly it went from rainbow to this look. Now I'm going to bring her over so you guys can see her face, and you'll notice that as I click the preview, I can see before and after. But what I want to note here to you guys is that it does do, I think, in my opinion, a better job in some ways than just doing it yourself and the default 25. But I feel that the way it has applied luminance adjustments, I think it's actually a little too artificial looking when it does it. It's a little too painterly. Her skin just looks too artificially smooth. So I feel that when you're doing this, what you might consider doing would be to go in and I'll zoom back over to her. I would go in and notice the colors a little bit better. See, I had done it before with the automation, and her lips look more red than it did with the previous one. But I'm going to go in and slide this back to around 25 to see what I see in terms of the noise coming back, the grain. I'm a big believer that the image should have the grain because it did in the first place, and I think it looks a little bit better when it does. But some people might say, well, I don't want the grain. So a happy adjustment from there would be maybe around 35 where you have the grain, but it's definitely a lot different than what we see out here on this image. So it's there, but it's not as dramatic. But if you want, for artistic purpose, to go to 50, you can. Depends on what the client wants. I kind of look at this from more of a realistic photojournalistic type of application to this, or a more realistic look to it. So I like to keep the grain back in there. But then again, you could go to 50 and you could add noise back in yourself, adding grain. So I'm going to go ahead and click enhance and let that chew through and create that while it's doing it. Let's see if I can do it a second time while it's doing it. I can. So let's do one with 50. It's like it's taking a minute to think about it because it's still processing, so I'll wait a second. It says it's going to take 55 seconds, so regrettably you might have to wait for this. Alrighty, so now we see that it has created the new image, and the new image is now called Noise Reduction DNG. So it adds an appendage or an add-on thing telling you what it's called. And if I unstack this, we can see that it shows up in the stack here as its own image, separate from the rest of the virtual copies that I've created. So I'm going to go back into the original virtual copy that I started with. Let's do, so this is the denoise. This one we did at 35. So once again, if we zoom in a little bit more on this, you can see that it still has some grain. I'm zoomed in here according to this around 400%. So let's go ahead and go to the original again. We will do a new denoise, and in this one I will go ahead and put it at the default of 50. Let it go ahead and create that. I'll enhance this. Once again, I will speed up the process so you don't have to hear this. All right, so here's the new one. It's been created. It's called NR2 because it's got the 50. So let's go ahead and compare it to the other one. I'll move this over so we can look at them. So here is 35 and here is 50. So it still retains a little bit of a grain appearance. It actually seems to have more grain appearance than it looked to have when we were in that DNG feature. But you have to be careful because if it softens too much when you're pulling out the luminance, it may change the appearance of your image. So one way you could bring back some grain if you wanted, if you weren't going to do 35, would be to go into effects, and then under effects, go ahead and add in some grain. So I'll add in a bunch here, and then I'll pull it back. And I will go in and make the grain larger. So you can see kind of a photojournalism appearance. And I'll make it rougher. And it's funny, it's applying it in a really weird way to this image. If I go back to this image, actually let's go back to this one. So I've got this one. If I was to add grain into this one, it just adds it in and it doesn't look as weird. But for some reason on the other end, it definitely looks a little on the weird side. So let's go back in. So zoom in, add a little bit more grain. And so you could add the grain in to make it look like film if you want to after the fact. And obviously you can mess around with how rough or how fine it looks. And you can also mess around with how large it is. Depending on what your appearance is. Obviously 69 is way too much. So the idea here is to create this like appearance of grain, and so here it is once again without, and with it added back in. So if I was to do something similar to that to this one, I obviously want to pull the roughness down, pull the size down, and pull up the amount. I can add back in the appearance of grain if I wanted to look more like this one. But I think 35 is still looking pretty darn good. It doesn't look like she's overly smooth compared to what she actually really looks like, which is actually, let's go back into here. So in this shot here, you can see what the original grain looks like. Here's the 35, and once again, back to the 50 in terms of the smoothing. But let's go ahead and remove the grain. This section looks a little airbrushed. So All right, there you have it, the new feature inside of Lightroom.